Well, we just heard then from Volodymyr Zelensky, who is in Oslo for talks with the Norwegian Prime Minister. Their meeting, of course, coming 2 weeks after the Norwegian government announced plans to more than double its financial support to Kyiv this year, to the equivalent of about $8 billion. Zelensky saying moments ago then that the two leaders discussed other ways to strengthen their defense partnership. And he also said that more generally, the EU needs to become more strategically independent given the current global landscape. Now, for more analysis on that idea precisely, Patrick Burry joins us on the program. He is a senior associate professor in warfare and counterterrorism at the University of Bath and also a former British Army captain as well. Thank you very much for joining us, Patrick. So could you perhaps start by just kind of painting a general picture of just how much the EU relies on the U.S. for defense and security matters? Where are the areas where they're perhaps most looking to become more independent?
Good evening. Yeah, in terms of the EU's reliance, it's certainly on some of the high-tech parts that America supplies. So you're looking at some of the aircraft, the F-35, others that are flying F-16s, some of the weapons and the avionics systems, the spares for all those. Some of the long-range munitions, the air defense systems like the Patriot air defense, of course, of which they're both very capable and useful, as demonstrated in Ukraine, but also rare, and nations like to hold on to them. So it's systems like that, the high-end, high-tech systems. There's also been, of course, since the start of the war, over 3 years ago in Ukraine. The US was initially able to be the only one that was able to produce, artillery shells, etc., at the scale, and even it needed to ramp up at the scale that was being used by the Ukrainians. The EU has slowly been able to meet some of those demands over time. So it's remained more at the high-tech area end of things, where the US and these pinch areas where the EU and its member states don't really have the capacity, or in some places even the capability, to develop, and it would take years to do so.
Now, the question of France extending its nuclear umbrella to protect other EU nations is one of the proposals, one of many proposals that we've seen for the bloc to boost its defense sovereignty. How much of this is political posturing as opposed to something that's viable or even necessary? And I mean, in other words, France and the UK, of course, possess nuclear weapons already. So why is that not enough?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, because it's certainly at one point, this is about just how many nuclear weapons there are. If you think about what the US security guarantee to Europe and NATO has been, the ultimate backstop is if there was to be a scenario where we needed to deter Russia with our nuclear weapons. Well, we have, about 4,000 of them. Russia has 5,500. The UK and France together have about 500. I mean, most people think about mutually assured destruction in terms of I have the bomb, and that means if they do it to me, I have to do it to, I'll be able to do it to them. Deterrence works like that. As we see, a lot of these air defense systems are quite effective, and there's obviously ratios which are calculated about how many missiles you would have to fire at what targets to get through. So if you take out 4,000 US missiles, in theory, I'm not saying that would happen, but in the worst case scenario, then that leaves other countries wondering, where would our umbrella, how would we be protected? And of course, then you start the discussions about, well, what could the UK and France do in those certain situations? So I think it's really a result of a worry, which we're not 100% sure about how worried we should be about the ultimate US backstop to NATO, but certainly a developing worry. You can see the way that European leaders like Poland, like France, have sort of read the tea leaves and said this: we may not be able to rely on the American nuclear deterrent in the worst case scenario.
The EU, Patrick, does, of course, have its own defense and security framework in the form of its common security and defense policy. But acting independently within that scope is, of course, limited by consensus restraints. What do you see as some of the major political barriers to the EU being able to boost its defense sovereignty, if we put the finances of things aside for a minute?
Well, it's obviously finances, clearly, and they're all having an argument about what mechanisms to do, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the thing for the EU now, I would say really two things. One is the defence industrial base, and that will take time, and it will take time, as I mentioned, certainly in some niche capabilities, and that has to start. The second one is in scale, so being able to actually produce enough stuff, changing logistics. Logistics have been done for the last 40 years on just in time. Just as long as it arrives just in time. Well, that's not going to be good enough anymore. It's just in case, and very clearly people are going to need stockpiles of stuff. So it's a big change in that. Finally, I'd say actually all across the EU, with some Scandinavian and Baltic nations excluded, we need to start working about the rights and duties of citizenship. What is expected of being a citizen? What are the rights that go with it, and what are the duties? So the people start to be educated about what is actually expected of citizens to defend their communities, and the sacrifices that may need to be made to do so, to protect them.
What do you mean by that? You mean that European leaders should put on the table some sort of a EU-wide service obligation?
No, absolutely not. No, I mean what I mean is much more like the Estonian models and some of the Scandinavian models, starting to get into the young people at different national curricula, explaining to them about as I said, this is not done, as I can speak much in the UK, about the rights and duties of citizenship, the role of the armed forces and the values of the armed forces and the security services and keeping communities safe, and what adversaries try to do, especially through disinformation, etc., and shape those. The work, the years that have gone by that unified Europe, essentially after the Second World War, everyone could remember the horrors of the Second World War. Everyone's parents, had fought in it. All that's gone. Those people are dead. Those values and myths are gone. People need to be re-educated. This is something we must work at to get young people to understand what's at stake.
This is kind of related to what you just said there, Patrick, and unfortunately this is the last question we have time for, but the European Union and the U.S. have obviously been historically very close allies, especially, coming out of the Second World War, which you just mentioned there. But it still seems kind of surprising that they've been so militarily dependent on Washington. Why do you think it has taken this long in such extreme circumstances like the war in Ukraine and the return of Donald Trump for the European Union to start thinking about a shift in strategy?
Well, listen, I'm not a major fan of Donald Trump, but, to be fair to him, Europe was just basically free riding for decades, and living off the fat of the land of American workers. So, it's been done. It's been done in a quite blunt way. But in fairness to the Americans, they've been saying it since at least the 60s that at Europe you need to step up, and we didn't. So it's a wake up time, and that's it. The rug's been pulled.
Patrick Bury, thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Thank you.